I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone, it's TGU time from VLGA Connect, sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Great to have you with us for our weekly chat on all things local government. And joining me around the virtual panel table is Julie Reid. Hi Julie.
Hi Chris. Hi Tony. How are you?
And Tony Rownick, of course, from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. G'day Tony.
Julie and Chris, highlight of my week again. Great to join you and the viewers.
And for those watching on YouTube, you might be able to tell that Tony's getting a bit excited about the 22, 23 degree days that have been forecast for this weekend.
Channeling the warmth, yeah, better happen.
Very good. Well, coming up today, as always, lots to talk about. We'll look at an exciting new waste-to-energy project, reaction to the government's latest housing plans, concerns over a rental agreement in Yarra, and the use of parking sensors in Maribyrnong. A Melbourne Council CEO announced this week that they're moving on, a new program to address workforce shortages in local government, and a campaign to encourage more people to become planners. Julie, I love that one. Plus, councils in New Zealand this week have been told by their Prime Minister to get back to basics, and it's a message that hasn't gone down all that well. Plus, Rhys Thomas will join me in the VLGA studio to look at the likely impact of structure changes on the upcoming elections and some fun facts about ward names. You don't want to miss this one. All right, Tony, Julie, where do we start? Julie, let's start with waste to energy. You might not have caught up yet on the local government news roundup this morning. I spoke with Mick Cummins about this project that's been 6 years in the making. It'll be a first on the eastern seaboard. The numbers are pretty staggering. It's going to divert 95% of waste away from landfill for 9 council areas. And something like 270,000, I'll check this figure, tons of carbon emissions to be removed every year. This is really big stuff, Julie, in the overall scheme of things, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that 270,000 tonnes annually diverted from landfill and traditional methods of disposal is equivalent to removing 50,000 cars from the road per year, Chris, which is staggering, isn't it? Staggering. This is a very exciting project for the Southeast, Chris. This is something that I was involved in very early on in the piece when we were having these early discussions when I was working out at Greater Dandenong. It is an amazing opportunity for these 9 councils to be able to remove their waste, go to a waste-to-energy plant, which is within reasonable distance. So we're talking about out at Latrobe. We're talking about something that it's not going to cost them a fortune for transport out to there. It's an agreement with Maryvale EFW Project Co-Proprietary Limited. It's a consortium between Veolia and Opal Australian Paper and Masdar Tribe Australia. So fantastic that they can send it out to the Latrobe Valley and not too far to go. Like I said, it's they're also really excited about it is the fact that they're going to create 500 temporary jobs during construction out in the Latrobe, which we know the Latrobe has taken a hit in recent times around employment, and an estimated 455 permanent operating jobs, which will have a great benefit to the community out there as well. So fantastic to remove from landfill, send to a waste-to-energy treatment plant. Waste-to-energy treatment plants nowadays, Chris, they are really highly regulated and they have strong controls in place by authorities like the EPA to make sure that they are not, or that they are actually not creating issues in the community in terms of any serious impacts or anything like that. So they are much better than what they used to be, and they are highly regulated. So that's the important thing, or the important message, I suppose, in all of this, is that it is much more sustainable in its practice. So look, I wish them well. I think it's a fantastic agreement. I believe it's for 25 years. So that's going to secure their disposal of waste for a serious amount of time. So hopefully some savings in that for the councils pulling together as well. So
Well,
look, great news story.
Mick tells me something like $100 million in landfill costs that they think they'll
Yep.
save as a
Yep.
result of this. The 9 councils, it started with 16. Apparently a few dropped off
Yeah.
along the way, and those that aren't in at this stage, they've lost the opportunity. So, maybe other arrangements can be made. We might see more councils coming together
Yep.
in this space. I imagine just setting this up from a legal point of view, Tony, has probably taken a lot of those 6 years to get the model in place.
Yeah, it would be interesting, the entity being created with all those municipalities involved. But look, I think this is the way of the future. This sort of cradle to cradle kind of life cycle of products. When a product's finished its utility, is it's in its first life, it'll be used in another way to create another utility. In this case, generating energy, and the other thing, it's a way of the future here, is this regional collaboration, which we've of course seen in the past, but I think we're going to increasingly see for these major projects across councils.
Yeah.
And look, hats off to Bayside and particularly to Mick Cummins for sticking with this, because 6 years ago, he was chairing this group and he stuck with it all that time, and finally it's paid off. There was a lot of bumpy rides along the way, and good on him that he stuck with it and shown some leadership in this space. So the company that they've set up is Southeast Metropolitan Advanced Waste Processing, and the 9 councils are all shareholders in that company. So potentially opportunities there for them. So great news, Chris.
It is great news. It won't be up and running until 2029, Mick tells me, so it'll take a bit of time to get all of that in place. There's some, I think, a couple coming online in Western Australia before then that'll give us a bit of a sense of how they operate. But this one is expected to be the first on the eastern side of Australia. So Victoria leading the way there, and I think hopefully a terrific example of what can happen when councils get together to solve some of these joint wicked problems that they have. If you're wondering who the 9 councils are, they're Bayside, Casey, Yarra Ranges, Whitehorse, Knox, Greater Dandenong, Cardinia, Frankston and Kingston. All right, the government dropped some new draft housing plans this week. I gather this was a bit of a surprise to some councils. Some reaction has come very swiftly. This is, in the case of Boroondara, extending the boundary of what they expected that activity centre to be by, I think the mayor said, about 800 metres. So again, this wicked problem of housing and the government moving very quickly. Council saying, yes, we understand that, but the level of consultation on some of these things has been lacking. Thoughts firstly, Julie?
Yeah, Chris, I think it took the councils by surprise yesterday when it dropped as well, because I think they thought it was going to drop today. Right. So I think there was a little bit of a scrambling around yesterday, getting ready to write responses. So yes, look, they've actually put it out, the draft plans out on their Engage Vic website. And they're saying that that's going to close on the 29th of September. So they are allowing now 4 weeks for a consultation with the community and with councils. And so that's the important message in all of this. Have a look at it. Have your say now, councils, as to what you think about all of this, and maybe think about asking the questions about, how the communities are going to be engaged in all of this as well, seriously. And that's what Boroondara's response actually says, Chris. They are concerned, as you say, about the increase in the activity centre. They've got concerns about some of those areas that are affected by heritage, where there might be planning developments up to about 6 stories.
4,500 heritage properties in that area.
They're saying that they're very concerned, obviously, about the impact on that area. But anyway, so they are also asking the question on behalf of the community about when the community can have a say about all of this, etc. When they can consider the community's views in all of this. Now, I suspect that through the Engage Vic process, that will be when there will be submissions coming in. I suspect that the community up there will be rallying, no doubt, to make comments in relation to that, particularly in relation to heritage, which is a very, very sensitive issue in Camberwell, as we know very well. So, so interesting. I haven't looked at all the other centres yet, Chris, but Hume has also put out a response. Their response seems to
a bit more measured. They're sort of welcoming the push for more housing, but they're saying it's not just a numbers game, and there's other elements that need to be considered here. And I think probably a few more councils yet to respond. But I guess, Tony, the question here is whether councils can rightly expect to have been consulted ahead of a wider consultation process that brings in the rest of the community.
And you're right. There is that opportunity for broader community consultation now. But I think the point made both at Boroondara and at Hume is that, you know, the government shouldn't be saying they've consulted with councils if they actually haven't done that. And I think that both Hume and Boroondara have questioned whether there has been that consultation or not. This will be controversial. Obviously, it takes appeal rights away from the community. Basically, gives creates a process to fast track these approvals. That takes it out of an opportunity for objectors, etc., to go to VCAT. So the government have got to do this if they're going to go anywhere near achieving their highly ambitious, probably unlikely, let's face it, at the moment, housing target. So they're pushing forward with that across these 10 activity centres across metropolitan Melbourne, and one would think that there's unlikely to be a lot of change. I think the government were likely to be pressing ahead with these programs in order to attempt to achieve this ambitious housing target that they've put up there in lights.
And what they were hoping for, Chris, was more of a partnership type approach in relation to this, because as Hume rightly points out, they don't just want bricks and mortar, as you said. They're wanting a thriving activity centre that's going to work, that's not just barrage through and then all of a sudden you realise that it's not going to work. It's not going to be the kind of environment that people want to live within. It's got to be successful and it's got to be really livable. Melbourne's well known for its livability, and we don't want to lose that by, just fast tracking housing without that consideration of livability. And that's what planners, are always considering in this. They're always considering the livability of spaces and places. So, which is really important. Look, in the press release out from Hume, they also mentioned as a group, Hume, Darebin, Kingston, Moonee Valley and Whittlesea have called for improved infrastructure coordination and buy-in from the Commonwealth Government, and for detail on new housing plans before they're made public. They called on that, but that's not obviously been adhered to. But they are actually also concerned about infrastructure. So that's an important point in all of this as well.
Yes, that call came out a week or so ago prior to these plans dropping. What do we think about the claim that has been made by the government that the fast tracking will reduce the time it takes to get these structure plans done from 5 years down to 12 months? 5 years sounds like it's overblowing it a little bit, or is it, Julie? Does it take that long?
Oh, sometimes it can take a number of years. If we're talking about rezonings, planning scheme amendments, it can take from the day dot, when you're starting the process, when you're doing the strategies, and then you've got the planning scheme amendment process, it can be up to, maybe, 3 to 4 years sometimes.
Okay.
I'm not too sure about 5 years. That would be a really complex case. I would say on average, not 5 years, but that they would be the extreme cases where there was lots of complexity in the proposal in the planning scheme. And I think what they're saying there is that, you know, they're often the ones that are most controversial and the ones where the community are involved, and there is lots of toing and froing, and there's lots of argument at panels, etc., that extends the time period to get it right. So, you know,
Yeah, fair enough.
but, you know, at the end of the day, you want good outcomes, really.
Yeah,
Well,
and
I
the
guess that's
delays are regularly not at a council level, though, aren't they, Julie? Often the
Yeah.
delays are, you know, on the minister's desk or etc.
Yeah.
So,
true.
whilst this process may well address that, we shouldn't say, you know, we shouldn't think that it's council's fault that these things perhaps take longer than they ought to. You know, there are multiple levels of government involved.
And you're right, Tony. It is a partnership around getting things out the door as quickly as possible. And so if councils are moving quick on things, then they're expecting the minister's department and the minister to move quick on things as well, you know. So it is a partnership in getting things out the door. So I would agree with you that nobody is perfect in all of this, and you've got a community to think of in all of this as well.
Good points. And I guess the concern for councils and others is if they're complex matters, if they're being rushed, whether you end up with a result perhaps that, as Hume is saying, is not ideal for people to actually live in.
That's
Those
right.
environments. All right, let's move on. A couple of stories getting some attention from the Herald Sun this week. One about Yarra, one about Maribyrnong. Tony, a bowls club in Melbourne has got a bit of bill shock apparently with a new rental agreement from Yarra City Council.
Yeah, we're talking about the Fitzroy Victoria Bowling and Sports Club. It's on Brunswick Street in Fitzroy, been around for many, many years, and it's been on a peppercorn rental for, I think, 21 years, $100 per annum. And with the expiry of that peppercorn arrangement, the new rental that you know, the rent bill that council have determined is $60,000 per annum. So clearly an enormous leap. And there's you know, identities at the club have come out in the media and talked about, you know, what a crushing blow this is for the club and the cost of running that facility. But what struck me with this is that this is often the case that councils will initially, you know, there'll be a project that it's very worthy, a community-based club, etc. The council thinks, you know, we're going to get behind this, back it, give it some land, charge it a peppercorn rent, and then over time, sometimes the financial position of that organisation, the patrons coming to that organisation can change, and council's still, you know, only getting a peppercorn rental and you know, not a great return to the ratepayers and the community to put back into other projects, and not fully aware of the situation at this club, but there's certainly instances where community organisations that have been supported by councils originally have turned into something else, and, you know, they've turned into more business enterprises, if you like. I'm not sure about this place, but often you'll have, you know, bowling clubs that end up being, you know, quasi bars on a Friday night where people are sitting around drinking wine and beer and not necessarily participating in the bowling. And yet that club might be being charged a peppercorn rental only, when in fact it's competing with private enterprises, you know, adjacent, who are, you know, pubs and clubs and cafes, etc.
Chris, I think we're going to see a trend of moving away from peppercorn rents. I think that the days of peppercorn rents slipping away from us because we have an obligation in local government now for financial sustainability. And we know that one of the biggest challenges for local governments across Victoria is financial sustainability. So councils now have an obligation under the Local Government Act, as we know, to be financially sustainable, and they have to make these tough decisions about what they're going to do with peppercorn rents. It just cannot continue the way it has been in the past, and so they are having to make these tough decisions that are unpopular. Let's hope they're dealing with it in a reasonable way. We can only hope that they've done their due diligence around this sort of stuff. But I just believe that, it is a move that all councils are probably going to be looking at. So we're going to see more and more of this because of that reason.
I guess, and the point you make, Julie, is well made about it's how it's done, how it's implemented, whether it's measured, whether it's perhaps phased, or I mean, this is a big jump, $100 to $60,000. I'm not going to quote the councillor that's been in the press because sort of conscious that we're into election mode now, and some of these issues are being used as platforms, obviously, and we don't want to buy into that if we can help it. But that one was in the Herald Sun this week. And also, Tony, one about Maribyrnong, which is spending $2.8 million. Actually, I'm not sure whether they've voted on this. I think it was coming up this week at a council meeting. This is for in-ground parking sensors, and the Herald Sun at least says perhaps that money should be spent on fixing roads.
Yeah, and I think you can understand it's an easy kind of populist type article. 2.8 million. It's over the course of 5 years. It's not in one hit that council's spending this money. But as you say, installing the in-ground parking sensors so they can police parking and no doubt collect revenue, which will go into that pot to be able to be spent on upgrading local infrastructure, roads, footpaths, parks, etc. This is just part of the balance that councils have to deal with every day. Do we invest in something that's unpopular but will generate some revenue so that we can invest in something that is popular? I think it's as I say, it's a sort of cheap hit in the media against Maribyrnong.
And this kind of technology, Tony, this is a no-brainer, really. I mean, this is the way of the new world for local government. I mean, this kind of technology has been around for probably at least the last 10 years from what I can remember, and many, many councils have introduced these pods into local areas. So it's not new. It's just sort of, it's just, I read it and I was a bit sort of, these are the financial decisions that council's got to make, and the use of technology today is expected of councils, isn't it? I don't know.
Yes, but it wouldn't have been too hard to find some locals that are not happy about parking enforcement. Go figure. But the council was contacted for comment was the only line in there, putting Maribyrnong's side of things in that Herald Sun article. So we might move on from that. Some updates on e-scooters after that recent decision at the City of Melbourne to cancel some contracts. Darebin, Marybeck and Moonee Valley have announced that they're partnering on a scheme. So they're going the other way, looking at trialling e-bike services in the inner north of Melbourne, and that will take in the City of Yarra as well, which is already conducting a trial. And next week at a council meeting, the City of Greater Bendigo is going to receive a progress report on its e-scooter trial, which is largely positive by the looks of it. They're saying there's been minimal complaints. Most people seem to be doing the right thing. There's a few tweaks they're going to bring in. So despite the City of Melbourne's position panel, e-scooters look like they're here to stay.
Yeah, I think they are here to stay, frankly, and possibly, even in the CBD at some point. But I think that we don't see in those inner suburbs you've talked about, or those regional cities you've talked about, Bendigo there too, Chris, we don't see the same sort of concentration of use that we see in the CBD. The same, use on footpaths that there's a constant sort of the busy footpaths, and there's a constant sort of clash between pedestrians and e-scooter riders. There's certainly potential for that in some of the high streets of those suburbs in inner Melbourne, but it certainly, at least at this stage, doesn't seem to have raised the angst. And the trial in Bendigo, as you say, has largely gone without concern, without issues, it would seem, and Bendigo are pressing ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense that you don't have the same level of footfall as what you're going to get in the City of Melbourne, so I think that it is a little bit different. But look, I think this is great that they're trialling these things to see how it works locally, and we can now probably do a scoot around the ring of the City of Melbourne, Tony, you and I. What do you think? Should we
well, I saw the photo
get on
of
the
the mayor.
scooters? Are we going to get Chris to get on one as well?
I'll be in that.
Yay!
I'll be in that.
We'll have to stream a TGU live from the banks of the
Well,
Yarra or something.
let's just do the whole show from e-scooters we'll get little
Yeah.
GoPros and some, if we can get some good internet, that is.
Yeah, I
But
know.
Tony, you were saying you saw
I
the
know.
three mayors get together on this in a
Yeah,
Melbourne
that
scale.
was a pretty good photo of the three of them with their mayoral gowns on,
Wow.
but riding very safely with their helmets as well, and on a road. I was
Right.
impressed. No dinking either.
Full
No
mar-
dinking.
full
That's
marks.
good. No deputy mayors on the back.
No.
All right, let's look at some internal issues, staffing issues at councils. Darebin CEO Peter Smith has announced this week that he has resigned. In fact, he resigned last month, and the council's been working on transition arrangements before announcing that decision this week. He's been at Darebin for less than 2 years, but it was at Port Phillip before that for over 5 years. And I wanted to note also a former senior executive in Victoria at Surf Coast and at Moira, Chris Cowley, who's been the CEO at the city of Burnside for the past few years, was announced this week as the new CEO of the town of Gawler. So there's an example of someone leaving the Victorian sector and doing exceptionally well in another state.
Yeah, they were good news or interesting news stories as well this week, Chris. I read that on the Darebin website, the comment from the mayor, Mayor Newton, who spoke about Peter, saying that Peter had a deep commitment, or has a deep commitment, to the values Darebin care about. And in particular, housing and homelessness, addressing the climate emergency and other social justice issues. And he's been a champion for those in need, supporting us to introduce Towards Zero. So he's obviously had an impact in the time that he's been there, which is wonderful to see. So we wish Peter well. I believe he's going to be spending more time with his family and pursuing other career interests. And I was interested to see that he was continuing his work as the chair of Placemaking X and taking on some new voluntary roles, one in particular as the co-president of the Place Institute. So a placemaker in a CEO is very exciting, and he's going on to deal with what is obviously his passion.
And, another long distinguished local government career in more than one state. I'm pretty sure Peter was a CEO over in South Australia as well in the past. But talking about local government pathways, the government, Julie, this week has made an announcement of a new pilot program, which is involving a number of universities led by RMIT. And this is to tackle some of those workforce shortages, I should say, that the sector has been plagued with for some time, including a cause dear to your heart, planners.
Yes, that's right, Chris. And that was very much a topic of conversation when I was in at LGV, was these workforce shortages. It's great to see this come to fruition. $6.3 million pilot program to try and address some of these workforce shortages across councils. It's a 2-year pilot which is bringing together a consortium of higher education providers, including RMIT, I think it was La Trobe, Victoria University, Swinburne. So that's great news. They're calling it, I think it's the Earn and Learn program. So it sounds quite interesting. I can't see much information about it just yet, but certainly it is going to be something that I think councils will be interested in. They're encouraging councils across Victoria to participate in the program, so to try and address these shortages. So I know that there'll be lots of councils interested, no doubt. So put your hand up for that and get in contact. I think the university is the contact for this one. Look, I think it's good. They're targeting particularly planners, I think environmental health officers I saw, and
engineering, I think.
Engineering as well. Yeah. So this is great. How far they'll get with that amount of money over 2 years, I'm not too sure, but it will certainly hopefully bring a bunch of people forward to be able to work in local government in those disciplines that are so much desperately needed, those gaps that desperately needed to be filled. So it's very, very good. I'm not too sure how much the peak bodies were aware of this coming, Chris. I don't know how much they were consulted. on this. So that's just something of note. I think it is important for the government to reach out and to connect with peak bodies in local government on these types of programs to see whether they can assist in some way. So I think it is just a message there really around, make sure your peaks are involved and know about these kind of programs so they can assist.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that either, although that may well have been the case. I do recall a few years ago, LG Pro and the government involved in in recruiting female planners, female town planners. I'm not sure how that's gone. Probably time to get an update on that. I noticed lawyers aren't on the list, Tony.
Yeah, we just need more of them, don't we?
While we're talking about planning, though, Julie, there's a terrific campaign started. I mean, the planning world is doing its own piece to try and encourage more people to take up the profession, aren't they?
Yeah, I was so excited about this as well, Chris. It's like everybody's got on the bandwagon. But remember, a couple of months ago, we were reporting on a program similar to this actually in the UK, where they were promoting the planners, recruitment of more planners into local government as well, or across the board at least. Now, the Planning Institute of Australia have launched their own program, and it's very bright and cheery and very interesting. It's very, very good. It's really a campaign to attract people to think about planning as a career, and it talks about urban and regional planning being about making neighbourhoods and towns and cities better for everyone. And they talk about the types of elements that you get involved in as part of a planner, and it sounds really exciting. So I was pretty impressed by the campaign. I've got to say, I mean, I had a fantastic career as a planner, so I always encourage people to think about planning as a pathway. There's a nice little video there, but it's basically been released by the Planning Institute. Well done to them for releasing this campaign. You can even take, now, Chris, there's a possibility for you and Tony to take a personality quiz, and you can tell what style of planner you could become. So get on there, get online, have a look and see what kind of planner you might be suited to become if you want a change in your career at this time in your life.
Don't think it's for me. Is there one for the impatient planner? I couldn't put up with put up with a 3 or 4 year process to get.
Got to be very patient as a planner. No. Resilient and patient.
All right. So becomeaplanner.com.au if you want to check out that campaign. We might pause to bring in Rhys Thomas for his weekly segment. We've got much more to talk about, team. Misconduct at the federal parliamentary level in the news this week. It'd be interesting to compare the approach here to how conduct issues are dealt with in local government and a few other things happening beyond Victoria's borders. We'll be back with more of the panel very soon. Let's bring in Rhys Thomas in the VLGA studio for this week's discussion with elections around the corner. Rhys, you've been delving into some really interesting stuff, some stats and quirky things about structures to talk about this week. How are you doing?
I'm well, Chris. It's good to be here. Yeah, I feel like we've been talking about elections for ages, but they're not getting any closer for some reason.
No, and I know we're going to get to single member wards. There's been this sort of view, and I've sort of helped perpetuate this a bit because we just assume it's going to change things dramatically. You're going to tell us that might not be the case, but what are some of the other structural changes that we need to be aware of in this cycle?
Yeah, well, so I suppose I'd talk a bit about the history because although the last election was the first election conducted under the 2020 Act, the actual electoral changes didn't come into effect until this one. So this is actually the first real change. So back when back in 2020, there were 11 councils that had multi-member wards where there were different numbers of councillors in different wards. And there were 13 councils that had a bit of a mixture where they had some multi-member wards and some single-member wards. And that approach kind of flies in the face of the one value, one vote principle that should underpin elections. So that was changed in the 2020 Act. And it was sort of imagined at the time that there'd be an independent electoral review of every council, and they would recommend the appropriate electoral structure, either being unsubdivided, equal multi-member wards or single-member wards. But there was a bit of a caveat to that, which was that before the Independent Electoral Commission or review panel could recommend an unsubdivided municipality, the minister had to give them special permission to do that. And those that were around in 2020 might remember that at the very last minute, without any consultation with the sector, that provision was extended to the application of multi-member wards. So essentially, the minister gets to decide what options are available to be recommended. And the minister did decide, it was Adam Somyurek at the time, decided that metropolitan councils in Melbourne had to be single member wards. That would be the only option available. So essentially what it meant is that there had to be a review of councils, all councils in Melbourne, almost all, and most councils across Victoria. And the electoral structures had to change pretty significantly this election.
I think there was an argument put in Parliament, wasn't there, that ultimately was given some credence that those smaller rural councils perhaps could put forward a different case for why they shouldn't be single-member wards, whereas it didn't apply in the metro areas.
That was the logic. I mean, I worked in local government at that time, and our view was that if you're going to have an independent panel, then you should give them the powers they need and trust them to recommend a model that suits the local community. But anyway, we are where we are. And what it meant is we had to do these reviews. So the wash up of those reviews, and they're in two parts effectively. The first part is actually to determine how many councillors the council should have. So for the purpose of this analysis, I'll throw Casey, Whittlesea and Moira's 2028 election back into the mix.
Right.
Say that of 73 councils, of those 79, the number of councillors hasn't changed as a result of that review. So it just remains the same. There's 3 councils that'll actually lose a councillor, Buloke, Northern Grampians and Yarra, and 2 councils will gain a councillor, Melton and Mount Alexander, and Moorabool Council, probably in recognition of its sort of interface and dramatic change nature of that municipality, is actually gaining 2 councillors. So effectively what that means is when you wash it all up, there's only going to be 1 more councillor in Victoria as a result of all these changes.
That's interesting, isn't it? And we've had a case where, and I think people are surprised to discover this, some councils have had an even number of councillors. Rhys, do you know if that's going to be the same under the new structure?
There still are some councils that have an even number of councillors. In fact, some of those councillors that have had a change in numbers have moved to an even number. So I don't think that's sort of, while it might be preferable, I suppose, to imagine that there'd be an odd number of councillors involved in every vote, it doesn't really work out that way. When you factor in someone might be absent, that someone might have a conflict of interest, which means they can't participate, there's always going to be tied votes. And, you know, that's why there's a mechanism to split them.
Meaning the mayor using a casting vote in those cases.
Correct, yeah. So when we look at the actual ward structure then, once we've got the number of councillors settled, of the 79 councils, there are 40 councils that are completely unchanged in structure. The boundaries might have changed, but the structure hasn't changed. There's 30 councils that'll be moving to single-member wards for the first time, and that includes Casey and Whittlesea, who are back into the fold. And so they're mostly in metropolitan Melbourne. There's 5 councils that are moving to an unsubdivided model from previously having wards, and there are 4 councils that are moving to multi-member wards, either from having different sized multi-member wards, they're now having equal sized multi-member wards, if that makes sense, or maybe they had a mixture of single and multi in the past. But interestingly, there's no councils that are moving away from single-member wards. Obviously, once you're in that model, the electoral panel doesn't really have an appetite to moving away from it.
Well, and I guess they take into account that it's sort of the default position that the government set in the legislation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it certainly seems to be, yeah.
Yeah. So what about that impact of single-member wards? Is it fair to say, as some have, that it's going to deliver major change around the council tables?
Yeah, look, I don't really know about that, and it's a bit hard to know, of course. We've got to speculate. But what I did is I've gone back and had a look at what happened in 2020, because in the 2024 election, there's going to be 30 councils moving to single-member wards for the first time, and that affects 273 councillors, or 42% of all Victoria's councillors will now be elected in a different way. So there's obviously potential for change. So by looking at the 2020 election, well, there were 72 councillors in 2020 who had moved from multi-member to single-member wards for the first time, and they were all in metropolitan Melbourne. There were 8 councils involved. So what I did is I went back and had a look at those 8 councils and what happened, and to put the assumption that there would be a significant change, I thought I'd put that to the test. So what I did is I had a look at the 56 councillors from those 8 municipalities who put themselves forward for election, re-election that is. So existing councillors who stood for re-election, moving from multi to single member wards. 44 of those councillors were re-elected. That's 79% success rate. So the idea that everyone gets tipped out of office, I don't know about that, 79%. In fact, you could argue that the rate's actually higher than that because of those 12 councillors that were not successful. 4 of them actually lost because they stood against another sitting councillor. So it's not possible for them both to be elected. So and look, another pattern that we saw for the most part was if you weren't elected, of those 12, you most likely came second. I think 11 of them came second. One of them, in fact, by only 50 votes. So I think what that analysis tells us is either we'll see a lot of, we won't see a lot of change, that and puts to bed that assumption that it'll tip a whole lot of councils out of office. It might tell us that, or it might tell us, in fact, nothing at all, because 2020 was very different, of course, because 2020 was an election during COVID period. There was very little campaign activity, next to no door knocking activity, certainly in Melbourne. And it's probably fair to say that most Melburnians, at least, had other things on their mind and maybe just favoured security about what they already knew. So it could be that was a good example of what might happen this year, or it could be a completely uncomparable situation.
It might be, or it might not. The answer, as they say, I think, is a pineapple, and we're not really going to know, is what you're telling us.
Well, we will know, but we'll know in November this year.
Until November. Right. Okay. What about names of wards? I know you've looked at this for a bit of a fun exercise.
Well, I thought I'd just have a bit of a look because I was working through a list of wards for something else I was working on, and I noticed some similarities. There's this principle in place naming that place names shouldn't duplicate each other unless there's a big distance between them. So that applies for roads and suburbs and things. So I thought I'd have a look at the names of Victoria's wards. There's 438 wards in Victoria in 2024. There's 10 ward names that are used twice across the sector. There's 3 that are used 3 times. So East Ward, South Ward, and Wattle Ward. And there's 2 names that are used 4 times, North and West. And you might get a bit of a pattern here. There's one name that's clearly the winner. It appears in 8 different municipalities, and it is called Central Ward. So very exciting.
That's a lack of imagination there, wasn't there?
Well, there's also a bit of a lack of imagination. Here's a fun fact. Chandler Ward, which is one of the ward names that's used twice, Chandler Ward in Knox and Chandler Ward in Yarra Ranges are only 2 kilometres apart. So if you're a candidate for those and you're putting up a corflute sign with the name of your ward on it, you might want to add the name of the municipality.
Good point. Yeah.
And Kingston has the status of being the least original municipality. 4 of its ward names are shared with other councils.
I don't think we'll see that in Kingston's marketing anytime soon. But
I'm not sure it's high on people's radar. But here's another fun fact. Baw Baw Shire is the most interesting of all, I think. Right. It's got one of its 3 wards is called East Ward, which, as you'd expect, sits at the most easterly point of the municipality. Makes sense. What you might not expect, though, is it also sits at the most northerly point, the most southerly point, and after a boundary rearrangement this year, the most westerly point. So even the
it should be called Compass Ward.
It should be called something, but I'm not sure that East Ward is the best name for it. In fact, even the panel made a note of that in their report. The other thing about Baw Baw is because of the concentration of residents in Warragul and Druin, East Ward actually contains roughly 1/3 of Baw Baw's voters, but occupies 95% of the municipality. Wow. And I'm not sure if Baw Baw's Central Ward occupies the smallest part of any municipality, but at less than 1.5% of the land area, it must go pretty close.
It's like Vatican City.
It is like Vatican City. But another obscure fact from Baw Baw is until they did the boundary review this year, there were actually 2 properties that were split in half by the ward boundary just because of a mapping anomaly, which I suppose creates the technical possibility that you could argue that which side of the bed you sleep on decides which ballot paper you receive.
Which ward you're physically in. Too much fun. You've got too much time on your hands, Rhys.
I think I might. So I think what I might do, Chris, is as we're moving into the pre-election period, maybe I'll just take a bit of a breath and step back from TGU for a while so I can regroup in the lead up to the election.
Well, we can help you there because we're going to have a little break over the next few weeks and represent some previous discussions that are related to the election period. So the team can
represent or Rhys present, perhaps.
Rhys, yes, there we go. Rhys present. All right, Rhys, that was a lot of fun. Thank you very much for doing the work to bring that to us, and we'll see you again in a few weeks' time. Thanks.
See you on the other side.
Another great segment there from Rhys, looking into all those vagaries of the ward names, the structural changes, etc. And of course, as we said, whether the single member ward changes actually deliver significant changes around the council table remains to be seen. It might not.
Looking forward to an analysis post the election and seeing what Rhys comes up with in terms of what sort of change, and then tracking that over time.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting.
Yeah.
All right. A quick update on the New South Wales nominations debacle. I had some mail about this during the week, because we talked about, what else could we call it other than a debacle or a fiasco. Amber wrote to me and said we should be using AFL parlance and call it a clanger. So I think that's one that we can probably put aside for next time when we have one of these issues. God forbid it happens. But team, you may be aware that the Liberal Party in New South Wales has, I think, wisely decided not to take legal action after all of those events last week. Tony, they got some advice from senior counsel before they made that announcement. So I think we can read between the lines.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I'm going to suggest the advice said that they probably wouldn't have much success in that challenge. And did I see, Chris and Julie, that with a lack of nominations at some councils, a number of councils have had the elections postponed in New South Wales?
So not so much postponed, but there's some wards in some councils where there were insufficient nominations. So that means they're going to have to hold a by-election. So it's not going to happen this time around. And I think 5 councils won't need elections because they've either had the right number of candidates, so people are being elected unopposed, or there's an insufficient number, so those by-elections will need to happen. So that's a sad state of affairs, really. 14 councils impacted by that particular issue across the state, mostly in rural areas, as you might guess. Remains to be seen whether we have that issue in Victoria, of course, as nomination time is fast approaching. This caught my eye. Tony, I'd be interested in your views. The Albanese government, according to The Guardian this morning, is bringing in an independent parliamentary standards commission, and under the proposal, the penalties for misbehaving MPs have been unveiled. And the comparison here obviously is going to be how these issues are dealt with there compared to the way we try to deal with conduct at a local government level. Penalties would include a fine of between 2 and 5% of a politician's annual salary, which means a backbench MP could be docked up to $11,680. And there's the potential for suspension from parliamentary committees. And where have we heard this one before? Mandatory training or professional development.
Yeah. Well, it's often been that, point of concern made by people in the local government sector that, there's, lots of provisions around conduct of councillors, but we see, sometimes poor conduct in our state and Commonwealth Parliament that doesn't seem to be policed as much. They have a speaker who's, elected by the majority, who's supposed to act independently and ensure that appropriate standards are maintained. But here we have, I think, a good move to, move away from the politicians governing themselves, if you like, in terms of their standards of behaviour, and move it off to, an independent adjudicator, arbiter. So I think this is a good move. It'll be interesting to see how this evolves, because we know that in local government, we're looking for ideas in terms of what are appropriate sanctions, what are appropriate standards, what does robust political debate mean in a local government context? Because there's a very similar, another context where that term is used in the Commonwealth and state parliaments.
Good points. All right, we'll watch that one with interest. Apparently, the Commission will be up and running by October and will have the power to investigate allegations of misconduct by politicians. In Western Australia, some changes are coming in with a reform bill, which look very much like things that have been in place in Victoria for some time. A new local government inspector with the power to appoint monitors to councils. They'll be able to handle complaints and manage investigations and inquiries. A few other provisions that mirror what we see here in Victoria. So you'd have to think that's a step in the right direction, Tony.
Yeah, I would think so. I think in some ways the West Australian environment's ahead of us in terms of the detail and specificity in their standards of conduct, but in other ways it would seem that they'd be behind in terms of this process for appointment of monitors. I think in this amendment bill that's now before the Parliament in Western Australia, there's provisions like greater early intervention powers for the monitoring authorities, increased penalties for council conduct breaches, including, I think, a proposal to withhold allowances for councillors for up to 3 months where there's a conduct breach. So that's a significant imposition, I think, or a significant sanction. But those I think that those provisions will be subject to some sort of debate and comment in public and in the Parliament in Western Australia, and will apply to, I think, 139 odd councils across Western Australia when they're ultimately adopted.
Just the odd ones, Tony? Just the odd councils?
Yes, just the odd ones. No, the odd and the even.
Chris,
yes.
I also noticed that they're going to widen the scope of audit committees. So they're going to go to audit, risk and improvement committees.
Okay.
So what does that mean, improvement committees? So that's definitely one to have a look at in terms of, what can audit and risk committees now comment on and make, recommendations on, etc. So that was an interesting one. The other thing is that they mention about facilitating the shared employment of local government CEOs and senior employees. So I assume that's sharing between councils, the ability to be able to run those processes. I'm not too sure, but anyway, that was specifically in there as well. And specifically mentioning that if council members will not receive their allowances if they fail to complete mandatory training courses.
Okay, it'd be interesting to see how those go down. The shared CEO one's interesting. I know there's 2 councils in Tasmania that share a general manager or CEO. So interesting to hear about that. And I'm fascinated by some of the things that happen in Western Australia. They have this electors meeting provision where if people get enough votes on a particular issue, they can force the council to hold a meeting to consider that issue. It's a bit like, forcing a referendum or a plebiscite. So that's an interesting one to see play out at various times. Let's go to New Zealand, where the Prime Minister there this week, Christopher Luxon, has told councils to get back to basics. He's basically saying they've been worried about the wrong things for too long, and the government's going to put money on the table for regional deals, and they'll only deal with those councils who do get back to basics. And this has not gone down well with some of the mayors over there.
Yes, Chris. I think we'll see more of this, in Victoria as well. This kind of urging sometimes for councils to go back to the basics. The language Christopher Luxon's used here is interesting. He says, call on councils to rein in the fantasies, live within your means, and cut spending on the nice to haves. Also talked about a crackdown on council officials keeping information from councillors. But look, I think, there's always elements of improvement that we can make in the sector. I think maybe, maybe there is some desire to see councils perhaps talking about the basics. I think councils haven't, in my experience, haven't moved away from actually delivering the basics, but perhaps some of the rhetoric at times has focused on some of these issues around, changing community attitudes to things. And that's where we've heard councillors speaking, and we've, there's been a focus in the media. And so, as I say, I think that perhaps councils haven't changed what they're doing, but perhaps some of the language is focused at times in areas that aren't traditionally seen as being, within the purview of councils. And that's perhaps what Christopher Luxon's picking up in New Zealand. I think we do see regular commentary like this in Victoria and other states of Australia as well.
Yes, we have indeed. I love this little piece of writing from Russell Palmer at Radio New Zealand, who said when the Prime Minister revealed this position at a local government conference on Wednesday, with mayors, councillors and officials in the room, as Russell says, who could be heard groaning as his speech went on.
And I would expect that, Chris, because that's wasn't really a very nice statement to make about reining in your fantasies, mayors and councillors. It's it would have, and it did upset a lot of the mayors, and obviously the mayors hit back, didn't they, Chris?
They did.
At the PM speech.
Yes, they have. So there's been quite a bit of coverage of that in New Zealand in these last few days. Let's finish in Canada. I know we had this on the list last week and we had to drop it for time reasons, but it did. This story came up as well on a panel we did for the VLGA this week on the changing nature of elections. Whitehorse City Council, not the one in Melbourne, the one in Canada, has adopted a civility policy, and maybe just the first of many to actually go down this path of sort of codifying the way issues are going to be dealt with in public meetings, etc. This is about the conduct of other people, not necessarily the councillors themselves. Julie?
Yeah, and there was much debate around the table about this one, Chris. What the new policy allows is sanctions for not only clothing, but comments in relation to sort of language that is detrimental, discriminatory, offensive, profane, racist, sexist, violent, vulgar, all that kind of stuff. So there's obviously been some issues there with people wearing things that might make statements, for example, that might have offended people in the chamber potentially. So participants now can be sanctioned by the council, and they've put in place a way in which that can be appealed, and that there's an opportunity for them to reconsider if they want to. But it's really going to be a bylaw, I think, from what I read in their news article, and it's to ensure everybody is treated with dignity, respect and civility in the meetings, and to ensure people are safe. So we are seeing a lot more of this, Chris, and now they've put this bylaw in at Whitehorse in Canada. Let's hope it works for them. It certainly sends a really strong message to those people that are attending those meetings.
We talked.
I want to see the detail. I think the notion that we shouldn't have, profanities or people standing up with the intent to deliberately cause offence and be discourteous and disrespectful. I agree with that, but I think that I think more often than not we see it's people taking offence rather than giving offence. I mean, is that it's someone in the audience say, I'm offended by that, rather than the speakers going out deliberately to cause offence. And I think we have to be careful with these laws that are designed to prevent offence. Let's say there are 1,000 people watching us now. There's a chance that something we've just said offends one of those people. And should we have to, should we be compelled to speak in a way to avoid offence to that 1 in 1,000 people? I think we can take this too far, and I'd really like to see the detail. And I think that people can be quite sensitive in choosing to take offence where it wasn't intended to be given.
And it's a good point, Tony, and it brings in that issue of free speech in some respects too, doesn't it? We talked last week about the UK Council, Thanet, I think it was, that's brought in a public protection order to fine people for swearing in the street. So that's being, surprise, surprise, challenged legally. The Free Speech Union has come out this week and said a few choice words about that being an attack on free speech, and they're going to take some action if the council doesn't back away from it. So, you know, there's a counter argument to a lot of these issues, isn't there? All right, we might call it quits there. And in fact, we're going to call it quits for a few weeks because we're moving into a pre-election period. TGU over the next few weeks will look back on some relevant discussions that we've had in recent months that relate to the elections while the panel takes a break. And by the time we come back, we'll be in the thick of it for elections in Victoria. I'm sure we'll have much to talk about, team. But in the meantime, we can have a little rest. What do you think about that?
Get to sleep in on a Friday morning. Wow.
Oh, it'd be like bliss.
Do that, recharge the batteries. We'll have lots to talk about when we come back in early October. It will be. Gosh, that sounds odd to be saying that at this point in time, doesn't it?
Time flies when you're having fun in local government. Hey, Chris.
It sure does. All right. Thank you, Julie. Enjoy the next few weeks and we'll see you then. And Tony, thank you as always. And to the team at Hunt and Hunt Lawyers for your support of the program. All the best for the next few weeks for you as well. By the way, where's your footy team sitting, Tony?
We've got into the 8, Carlton. Yeah, we're you know, the wheels had fallen off a few weeks ago, but look, I'm thinking we've got to get over St Kilda this weekend, and
right. Okay,
you know, we'll be there for finals.
Well, I'm thinking of you. No, I'm not. I'll be focusing on Hawthorn, and that's about it. All right. So thank you. All the best. We'll see you again soon for more TGU from VLGA Connect. But until then, bye for now.